Hello, my name's Dennis Reschke. You've tuned into the program Fresh Bread, a program that's dedicated to discussing the things of the kingdom, Christianity. Today's topic will be dealing with church history, kind of an overview of the Bible, of where the church has been since the resurrection up to the present. I'm kind of a big picture person, so I like to give a context by which we'll understand later topics that deal with more specific issues. So I'm going to talk briefly, kind of an intro, and then for each book of the Bible, I'll give a very, hopefully brief discussion of what each book of the Bible entails. And then I won't finish today. There'll probably be a 3 or 4 session program on the history alone. So there's 66 books in the Bible. 39 are the Old Testament and 27 in the New. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew to the Jews. The New Testament is written in Greek and Aramaic, which is kind of a slang Hebrew of the time. If you look at the first 3 chapters of the Bible and the last 3, you get a very obviously cursory view of what God's all about and where kind of a big picture, a thumbnail sketch. The first 3 chapters of the Bible deal with creation, and I deal with this in more detail in my creation evolution course, but it culminates in God's creation of man, Adam and Eve, which he called very good. They were given a garden, a beatific, idealistic place to live, free of death, free of lack, all needs met. God spoke to them face to face. They had perfect communion with God. And then sin entered. The New Testament said that Adam wasn't deceived, but Eve was, by Satan. I believe it was Satan who manifested in the form of a serpent, which is supernatural, obviously, or a snake. And he, through his guile, made them question whether God was really for them, that he was trying to withhold something from them, even their supposed godhood or the knowledge of good and evil. So, and they took the bait, and as a result, they were ousted from the garden because God didn't want them to eat of the tree of life, which would perpetuate sin. And immediately in Genesis 3:15, God talks about how he's going to redeem man, how he's going to bring him back to the fold. But at that point, he didn't have any hegemony over the earth anymore. He had given it to Adam to take, and then Adam gave it to Satan. So it's out of God's hands, but through a Redeemer, Jesus Christ, God's plan was to purchase back man. Redeem means to purchase what was taken. Like if you go to a pawn shop and you give them a guitar, you get a ticket for it. And if you get the money, you can buy back your guitar. That's redeeming it. Only the price of redemption of man is the blood of Christ. So man gets kicked out of the garden, but he has enough information, verbal communication, a revelation of rudimentary knowledge that there's going to be a Redeemer and that there's a resurrection of life. That is, there is something after life with God in heaven, and that there would be hell too as a recourse if those who didn't choose to believe. And so that ends the first 3 chapters, and the last 3 describe in its future to our time how that redemption plays out. And we'll see in the last days that man's sin has been forgiven through Jesus, and that manifestation of that at the very end includes the taking away of death itself, that we will be immortal, that death will be put away forever, Satan will be put away forever. There will be no sin, there will be sickness or disease or lack. And the place we live will be even better than the garden before the fall. God will come down to earth, it says, and live with men. It won't be in heaven anymore. And this is arguable how you interpret this, but it talks about the New Jerusalem floating in the air, a 1,600 cubic mile city floating in the air, which is not possible in the present day physics. So it's possible that even the laws of physics will change. It talks about a new heaven and a new earth. So it's possible that the redemption of man includes changing of the very fabric of matter itself. So that's the thumbnail of the Bible. Everything in between is really, somebody coined the phrase BIBLE, the basic instruction before leaving earth. It's not scripture, but it speaks. The Bible is basically giving us, all right, what do you do now? Sin's here, how do we live until the fruition of all things, which is future yet? So that's what the intervening books are all about, kind of. So from that ousting of the garden, there were several prominent figures that emerged. They are called variously patriarchs. Noah, well, probably before Noah was a man named Enoch, whose claim to fame was that he pleased God so much that God took him before he physically died and took him in bodily form. And he was 7 generations after Adam. The generations in the early Bible are very long, in the order of 1,000 years, and I deal with this in more detail in my creation evolution course. But so 7 generations would be quite a time from Adam. But even and the next prominent figure was Noah. Adam was still alive at that time, I believe, or during Noah's lifetime anyway. And sin had become so extreme that it affected all of humanity and even the land itself. If you've seen this recent film starring Russell Crowe, dealing with the life of Noah, the opening scenes, I think, are accurate. It looks like a lunar landscape that he's living on. It's just like lava. It's just horrible. No vegetation, just rocks everywhere. And I don't know if that's not accurate. If you look at the Hebrew word during Noah's time that described the earth, it was sin, actually, that destroyed the earth, not the flood. And that's what you see in this film. It's just horrible. And so Noah was found righteous in God's sight, and his family, he and his family were saved. God told him to build an ark. The earth was flooded. I believe it was a regional flood. And I go through this in my creation evolution course in more detail. Then he repopulated the earth, and several generations passed, and we come to a man named Abraham. Abraham was the father of the Jewish nation, the Hebrews. He lived around 2000 BC, and he begat several sons, generations, and they ended up in Egypt after a while because of a famine. Egypt was not too far from present-day Israel, about 11-day walk. And things went well there for a while. They started out with 70 people, ended up arguably with upwards of 1 million people. And by that time, the administration of Pharaoh and the Egyptians were afraid of the Hebrews because they become so numerous, and they thought they might take over. So they enslaved them. And so the last 100 or so years were bad for the Hebrews there, and they cried out to God, and God gave them Moses, a deliverer named Moses, who took them miraculously out from under the Egyptian yoke into the wilderness, where God introduced the law, what we call the Torah, first 5 books of the Bible, and the priesthood and the 10 Commandments were given during this time. And that went on for several hundred years. Several prominent figures emerged called judges who delivered the Jews out from under various other people groups who had conquered them because of the Jews. They left Yahweh in our heart and started worshiping other gods. It went ill for them. They were taken captive. God delivers them through a judge. They get back on track, fall away again. This whole cycle repeats over and over in the Old Testament. And that continues for several hundred years until the time of kings, the first of which was Saul, followed by David, and then Solomon. These are probably the most important of the kings. After that, the kingdom was divided. By this time, there was 12 tribes of the Jews, and the northern half, called Israel, were about 10 tribes, and the southern, the 2 tribes, and they were called Judah. The Israel lasted about 200 years until the Assyrians conquered them in 721 BC. And another 100 years, about 600 BC, and the Babylonians conquered the southern half, and they were in captivity there in Babylon for 70 years. The northern tribes, you don't really hear of them until the Revelation again, in the very last book of the Bible. And they're pretty much dispersed as a people after being taken by the Assyrians. The tribes, individually, the Jews would still be of whatever tribe they were from, but as a people, you don't really hear of them after that throughout history. But in the southern tribe, they were taken captives by the Babylonians for 70 years, that was prophesied, and then they were in turn conquered by the Persians, and the Persian king Cyrus was favored the Jews going back to Jerusalem and repopulating their native land there, and that occurred in 536 BC. Then there were 400 years of silence, revelational silence. That is, after the Old Testament prophets wrote what they wrote, you don't hear of anything prophetically written for about 400 years until John the Baptist emerges on the scene, and then followed by Jesus. So the New Testament opens with the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, followed by the book of Acts, which is a historic account of the first century church, followed by epistles, they're called, which are letters written by apostles to various churches or people groups, and then the last book, called Revelation, deals with future events and the millennium, which I'll discuss in more detail in a course in eschatology. So let's now go through each book individually. Again, this is very cursory. If this was done correctly, this would be a year course to go through this. So this is just to give you a ballpark kind of understanding of what's in the Bible and how to fit what will more or less be talking about things of the New Testament in context of the bigger picture. So Genesis was the founding of the Jewish nation. It's thought that Moses penned the Pentateuch. I use the verb penned a lot. The scripture says that it's scripture itself, the word, is inspired by God. God didn't possess people like in automatic writing where they had no control over their pen. No, he inspired it, or influenced it would be another word, or I use the word penned, to suggest that God told them what to write, but they wrote it in their own words. And if they did throw them anything else in, it was inspired also, but their personality comes out. And Moses probably penned some of those first 5 books, but he also drew from other writings of his time, but that editing was also inspired. And the Pentateuch is the books Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It includes the Torah, which is the Hebrew word for the law. Genesis talks about Adam starting a verbal heritage, a verbal communication. After he was ousted from the garden, he communicated to his sons and the peoples that started coming out of his lineage about what God told him, things in the garden before the fall, and that became the basis of verbal communication, the basic rudiments of the gospel, which in a very, very short form would be that there is a Redeemer coming, some person that would redeem man from the curse that was imposed in the garden, and that we would be raised from the dead, that there's something after this life, a life after death. Cain and Abel were Adam and Eve's first 2 sons. Famous story of Cain killing Abel because Abel seemed to have the favor of God and Cain didn't. But it was really, if you take a close look at it, a manifestation of attitude. Abel had a good attitude. It wasn't that God hated Cain or something. It was Cain that drew God's displeasure by his attitude. And God said, if you change your attitude, things will go better for you. Enoch is described here. I've talked about him. Noah then came, and I'm jumping forward in the book of Genesis, talks about the flood. I believe it was a regional flood, not a global one. I go into this more detail in my creation evolution course. The rainbow was shown in Noah as a sign that God would never judge the earth in the form of a flood again. And he made a covenant with Noah. There are 7 covenants cut by God with various people, Noah being one of them. And I'll discuss, excuse me, I'll discuss this more in detail in another session dealing with covenant. And going forward in the book of Genesis, Nimrod was Noah's great-grandson. And this was an interesting incident. By this time, people had still, after the flood, had not dispersed. God's intent was that the people of God would disperse throughout the whole earth, but they didn't. They just kind of stayed there in what we call the Middle East area. And one reason was because I believe they just had one language. And at this passage, at this time, Nimrod and he was kind of a leader of a city, and he decided to build a tower in arrogance, really, against God, to say, we're our own God, we don't need you. And God said, no, that's not happening, because if I let it go, things will go back to what they were before Noah. So it says he confounded their language. And I believe this is where language came from, where even linguists today don't really have a good explanation of how languages emerge. And this is, to me, one explanation of it. It was supernatural. But that's arguable. Not everybody believes that. Abraham, then, is the next prominent figure. He is the father of the Jewish faith. He was the original Hebrew, if you will. And God got a hold of him and said, go west, young man, and I will give you a land there and a people, a nation that will come from your loins, from your progeny. And that's now the land which we call Israel, the Palestine area. And he this is another covenant, cut a covenant with Abraham. Covenant, I will cover, as I said, in another session. So 25 years it took for that fruition of a seed, of a child. Sarah, or Sarai, his wife, Abraham's wife, was barren from birth. And at this time had passed the time of, she was in menopause. She'd passed menopause, so kind of a double whammy there that she couldn't have children. But supernaturally, this occurred, but they got impatient during that 25 years waiting, and Sarah said to Abraham, "Hey, let's do this through my maid Hagar." And that was common back then. Today it would be kind of outrageous, but so Abraham had intercourse with Hagar, and Ishmael was conceived, a boy, and this boy became what we think of as the Arab nation. The Arab ethnicity came from, and Muslims to this day recognize Ishmael as their forefather. But Isaac was the son of promise, and he came later supernaturally through Sarah, not through Hagar. Another interesting note in Genesis, also dealing with Abraham, was at one point his nephew Lot got in trouble. He'd been captured by an enemy, and Abraham and his servants recaptured them, took some booty in that foray, and this guy called Melchizedek shows up, and Abraham worships him and gives him a tenth or a tithe of the booty. Two things about this incident. One, the tithe is initiated here. The idea of tithe just means tenth of materially what you have, and giving it to God. And the other is the idea of epiphany. Some believe that Melchizedek was an epiphany, which is a fancy word for God appearing in the flesh. And not all Christianity believes in this, but I believe that Melchizedek was God, and it's a mystery to me, but that he appeared, and God Abraham worshipped him and gave him a tithe. So that's that description in Genesis. And then a couple generations later, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph was one of the 12. So 12 sons emerged out of Jacob's lineage, and they became the 12 tribes of Israel. And Joseph, long story short, ended up in a very high position in Egypt as second to command to the Pharaoh, and saved Egypt and the Hebrews from starvation in a famine that was occurring, and brought, at that time there were 70 people, 70 Hebrews, the extended family of Joseph, to Egypt, where they multiplied and did very well, up to something up to 1 million people at the time of the Exodus in Egypt. So about 400 years passed. As I said earlier, they at first, the pharaohs and Egyptians were treated well in Egypt, but then the last several decades there, they were enslaved, in fact, and made to make bricks for the building projects of Pharaoh. And the Hebrews cried out to God. God raised up a man named Moses, who was a Jew, a Hebrew, but he was raised in Pharaoh's household. But because he murdered someone, he ended up in exile in another back part of the country there, and God supernaturally brought him out to save the Hebrews from the Pharaoh, and through 10 plagues and supernatural events that occurred, they made it. They exited out from under the yoke of Egypt. Initially, the Egyptian army went after them, and they were killed supernaturally again by the intervention of God. And then they ended up in the wilderness, in the desert there, in that Sinai Peninsula area for 40 years. And the Exodus is the term used for that change in locale from Egypt to the wilderness, to the Promised Land, which is what we call Israel today, that Palestine area. And this occurred around 1600 BC. So the next book is Exodus, and it, as I said, it talks about the fleeing into the wilderness, the parting of the Red Sea, and the drowning of the Egyptian army, the Ten Commandments, and the law. The law actually contains over 600 laws. The Ten Commandments are just a kind of summary or compilation of those. It's also termed the Decalogue. And during this time in the wilderness, manna was provided by God, which was a supernatural food, kind of like dew in the morning. They would scrape it off the ground, and it tasted kind of like wafers, and you could boil it, cook it, fry it, whatever you wanted. Also, water was supernaturally provided for them in the desert, because if you look out there, there's nothing but rocks. So it had to be provided for in that time. And in addition to the laws, God introduced the tabernacle, which was a tent, just a fancy name for tent. And it was divided into 3 sections: the outer court, the inner court, and the Holy of Holies. The outer court, where the people could come. The inner court was just for the priesthood. The priesthood was originally, the high priest was Aaron, who was Moses' son, and his line became the priesthood line, lineage. But they were in the tribe of Levi. And the Levites, those who were not of the Aaronic line, were kind of priestly orderlies. They helped the priests in their duties, and they helped around the tabernacle and that sort of thing. So all their duties and rules and so forth were promulgated by God to Moses at this time. The Ark of the Covenant was, God asked Moses to build this. It's basically a gold-covered box where the 10 Commandments, which were carved in stone, were kept, along with some other articles, and that was kept in the Holy of Holies. The priests could go to the inner court, but only the high priest once a year, which was like a president of the priest. He would go into the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was, and where God himself manifested as the Shekinah glory, which is kind of a cloud, once a year to make atonement for the people's sin. And I'll discuss that later when I talk about atonement. The other thing I'd like to point out this time is the progressive revelation of Yahweh, or Jehovah. That's the Hebrew word. There's 3 basic epithets for God: Yahweh, Jehovah, and Elohim, and Adonai, or Master. And then there's many compound names: Lord God, Jehovah, Elohim, and so forth. There's over 80 titles, if you will, of God talked about in the Old Testament alone. And some would argue that the God of the Pentateuch is different from the God of the Psalms, which is different from the God of the prophets, which is in turn different from the God of the New Testament. And that's not true. If you don't understand the revelatory nature of God, what do I mean by that? If I can draw an analogy of a parent and child. And when the infant is first born, it knows nothing. It cannot understand you. All it understands is yes and no, mama, dada, very, very rudimentary. And then as time goes on, the brain develops, emotionally develops, and so forth. More concepts and more responsibilities and privileges are afforded that child. And they enter adolescence, and they might think differently of their parents, that, oh gosh, they're not as smart as I thought they were. And then you enter in your 20s and 30s and realize, well, they really did know. The analogy isn't perfect, because the parents indeed do change somewhat as the child grows, and God doesn't change. He says, I am the same yesterday, today, and forever. I am the Lord, and I change not, it says in Malachi. But at first, even as a people, as humans, what God could reveal to them through revelation was limited, and they could only take a certain amount. In fact, there in the In the desert, he manifested himself, and they didn't want to have anything to do with him. They were afraid. They said, Moses, you just tell us what to do. We don't want to deal with Jehovah. He's too scary. And so that's an example of God can't reveal himself as much as he would like, because we can't handle it. But as Scripture goes on chronologically from the Pentateuch all the way to the book of Revelation, we do see a different God, but it's really God revealing more and more of himself as we mature as a people. So keep that in mind as you read Scripture. The next book is Leviticus. It deals with the Aaronic priesthood. Aaron is the first of many a line of the priests. It deals with the law and what the Levites do. There's 3 themes in this book. The first, holiness of God and requirements for fellowship with him. And then the sin nature of man. And then finally, God's provision to deal with the latter, with sin, which is the atonement. And so back in the Old Testament times, when you sinned, there was provision in the law to make animal sacrifices through the priest to God, and that sin was covered, but it wasn't really dealt with, and we wouldn't see the fulfillment really of the blood sacrifice until Jesus, who paid the ultimate price of his own blood, and so sacrifice of animals is no longer necessary. But initially, God uses animals because he said in Leviticus that life is in the blood, and the recompense of sin is death, the Scripture says. So when we sin, death enters, and the only thing that can remedy death is life. And God chose to use animals at the beginning for this, but later through his son Jesus. And so since the advent of Jesus, we don't need animal sacrifices anymore. All right, going forward to the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, it literally means just repeating a second iteration of what's already been said. So a lot of what's in that book has already been dealt with in Leviticus and other of those numbers. Just pointing out a few salient points. Chapter 17 prophesies that Israel would have a king, and that it wasn't God's will, which happened later on. Chapter 28 deals with the blessing and cursing involved in the Abrahamic covenant. And in Galatians, the book of the New Testament, as Christians, we are beneficiaries of that Abrahamic covenant. It also speaks of the fact that the Jews were promised way back in Egypt that they would all come to the promised land, but only 2 of them made it, Joshua and Caleb. Joshua was kind of Moses' right-hand man who later replaced him as the leader of the Hebrews, and Caleb was one of the 12 spies that initially went out to look at the land that was promised them to see if they could take it. And he said yes, along with Joshua, but the 10 other spies said, no, they're too great for us. They're not. Let's just stay out here in the wilderness, or even go back to Egypt. And God didn't like that. But only 2 people out of the million or so made it. Now, God made a cutoff of 20 years. So in other words, those who were 20 years and younger at the time of the Exodus, they were allowed to go into the new promised land. By then, 40 years later, they're adults. And so God didn't hold them responsible for the attitude of their parents who said, no way, we can't do this. And so at the end of the book, Moses dies, Aaron dies, replacements are made. Joshua is now the head of the Jewish nation, and he takes them into the promised land, which takes us to the next book of Joshua. So this is a book that describes the taking of the land, city by city, people by people. Just a couple points I want to point out in this book. One is that sin is quantitative. What do I mean by that? as I said earlier, the wages of sin is death. So some sort of death is incurred every time sin occurs. And that can take on various manifestations. It doesn't mean you're just going to die instantly, bodily. There's 5 types of death, as far as I know, that are described in the Bible. The most, I think, important to us in this discussion is spiritual separation from God. That's spiritual death. But it can affect physical things too. And one of them is the land. As I mentioned earlier in that film of Noah and Russell Crowe, that the land was devastated. It was shown like a lunar landscape. It affects the land. I think that's accurate. And there's an incident in this book of Sodom and Gomorrah, which was steeped in horrible sin, and God said it was so bad that not only do I need to destroy the people, but also the land. It was basically sterilized by burning sulfur from heaven. And when you see in the book of Joshua, as you see the army of Israel conquering this people or that, sometimes God would say, kill everything, even the animals, men, women, and children. Sometimes he would say, spare the animals, but all the people. Sometimes spare the animals, spare the women and children, but kill the men. And the basic premise behind all that is the degree of sin that those particular people at that particular time were participating in. The more egregious the sin, the more stringent the sterilization process, if you will. It's important it says in Ezekiel that God takes no pleasure in the destruction of the wicked. It might not be apparent if you just read the first 5 books, but taken all together, all the Old Testament and New, the idea is that God wants to save everyone, without exception. But he knows that not everyone will accept him as God and as their Lord. And if he allows those people who refuse to accept him, who are now maybe even practicing really horrendous sins like murder and burning children as human sacrifices and such, that it's really a merciful thing for him to cut short their lives, because it affects the land and affects other people, that they become infected, if you will, by that sin. So during this time, that should be an underlying understanding that depending on the depth of the sin of those people, God would instruct them to various degrees of destruction of the people there. Okay. And the next book is Judges. So by this time, the 12 tribes haven't taken the whole of the land that God first promised Abraham, but a large part of it. And they're dealing with some of the aftermath of the tribes, of the people groups that are still there, whom they didn't conquer, or outside areas, armies that are harassing them. And a basic cycle that occurred all through the Old Testament, it was the Jews would listen to Yahweh, they would do the commandments, they would practice the priesthood and so forth, and then they'd slip away and fall into idolatry of other religions, pagan religions of the time. They'd get in trouble, they'd be conquered by another people, they'd cry out to God, God would deliver them through a judge, a person. They'd get back on the wagon, if you will, get back into worshiping God, and then fall away again. And this cycle would occur over and over and over and over again. Well, Judges deals with about 300-year period since they're in the land, and this cycle occurred over and over, and God would raise up a deliverer, a person called a judge or a patriarch, who would save Israel, usually through military means, and then they would be right for a time and then go again into idolatry. And this continued until the monarchy began under Saul. I'll get to him in a minute here, where the cycle continued, but now instead of a patriarch, they had a king. Is basically the only change. The next book is the book of Ruth. This deals with a couple who were in Moab, adjoining country to Israel. Naomi was the wife, and her husband dies. She has two sons, they die. And so it's now Naomi and her two daughter-in-law, and Naomi tells them, go back to your native land because there's nothing I can do for you. I can't remarry. I'm going to go back to Israel. You can do whatever you want. Well, one of them goes, but Ruth, one of her daughters-in-law, decides, no, I'm going to stay with you. I'm going to come with you back to Israel. I'm going to be an Israel. I'm going to convert basically to being a Hebrew. I'm going to adopt your God. And so Naomi says, okay. And this book, short book, deals with Ruth, who was a Gentile. Gentile just means non-Hebrew, non-Jew. And her dealings with a man named Boaz, who eventually marries her. And long story short, she becomes part of the lineage of Christ. In a lot of Old Testament books and in the Gospels, they'll list long genealogies. And Ruth is listed as part of the lineage of Christ, which is remarkable to the Hebrew mind because she was a Gentile, which is kind of a no-no. Though it was an underlying theme, it wasn't prominent in my estimation, but an underlying theme that God intended not just to single out a small people group called the Hebrews from Abraham as his chosen people and forget about everybody else. His intent was that through these people, through the Hebrew people, that he would reach the other nations. He would start first with these people, but then extend out. But the Hebrews never got it together, basically, in themselves, and certainly not as an evangelistic tool, if you will, for the rest of the world. It just never happened during their time. All right, so next book is 1 Samuel. So he was the last of the judges. He was the first of a whole generation of prophets. He started the school of prophets, so he was the father of prophets. The book covers a period about 150 years between the birth of Samuel until David, the second king. The first king was King Saul. He started out well, but it ended up poorly. He basically reneged on his relationship with God. God separated himself from him. Saul never repented, and he died in infamy. David took over after Saul, and arguably he was the greatest king that Israel ever enjoyed. And his son was Solomon. But in 1 Samuel, though, the book describes, among other things, the Davidic tabernacle. And tabernacle just means tent. And David, during his 40-year reign, decided he was just zealous for God. He loved God. He was a prophet. He was a king. He was a priest. He was not of the tribe of Levi, though. He was the tribe of Judah, which was not of the priestly line. Yet, by faith, and you have to take the New Testament in account here to understand this, he did things that couldn't be done outside of faith. He took the Ark of the Covenant out of Gibeah, where the tabernacle was at that time. It had moved around quite a bit through the years. And just set up a tent in Jerusalem area where he worshiped God for 24/7 for 40 years. An amazing thing. Just in the last 20 years or so, this idea has been resurrected, and it's been prophesied that it would resurrect in the last days. And he acted like a priest, and yet was not killed. He should have been killed for what he did. Uzzah was killed for what he did. I can't go into a lot of detail. And also Uzziah, king, he tried to act like a priest and was killed for it, but David wasn't. And the reason was how they did it. David did it by faith. These other guys did it out of arrogance or ignorance, and it did not fare well for that. 2 Samuel, the next book, deals with David's rulership, his adulterous relationship with Bathsheba is dealt with here, and they had a child together. The child died, but then later Solomon came from this couple. David had several wives. And towards the end of David's life, he wanted to build a temple for God, a building, and didn't wanted to get away from the tabernacle. The idea of God living in a tent bothered him. And God said, okay, but I'm not going to have you do it. I'm going to have your son do it. And so David was allowed, he was given the plans by God of what the temples were to look like, and he amassed materials for it and money for it, but it wasn't until Solomon, his son, until the first temple was erected. Next two books, 1st and 2nd Kings, deals with the many kings after Solomon. And most of these didn't do well. They worshipped pagan gods, and only a few of them worshiped Yahweh as was prescribed by the law. And this was a time of prophets where God would speak through various prophets, both to the under Solomon's time, Rehoboam, the next king after Solomon, the 12 tribes split to 10 northern tribes and 2 southern tribes. North was Israel, called Israel, and the southern Judah. And these prophets in the northern kingdom were Elijah, Elisha, Jonah, Hosea, Obadiah. And in the southern kingdom, Joel, Amos, Micah, Habakkuk, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Zephaniah, and Nahum. And their basic message was, get it together, boys. Get back to Yahweh. They were kind of in a similar theme. And that's a gross swath there, but that was basic there, the message. Let's see. And then 1st and 2nd Chronicles is this next couple books. Same period as the Kings, but from a different perspective, from a godly perspective. So that a lot of the same incidences are described, but from a little different perspective. And during this time, Solomon's temple was erected and dedicated. The Queen of Sheba visited Solomon and his temple, and Solomon, under his reign, was probably the wealthiest that Israel ever became. It talks about silver being so prevalent that they just threw it out back in dunes in big piles and didn't even bother counting it. The northern kingdom was taken captive a couple hundred years later after Solomon by the Assyrians, and the southern kingdom about 100 years after that by the Babylonians. And in the northern kingdom, those tribes were dispersed. You didn't really hear about them ever again until the book of Revelation, which then describes people from all 12 tribes. But as a people, they were dispersed, and only the southern tribe remained as a people group. And in Babylon, they were there in captivity for 70 years, and then came back to Jerusalem. And during that time, the Babylonians were overcome and conquered by the Persians, and under King Cyrus in 539 BC. Sanctioned a remnant of the Jews to go back to Jerusalem and repopulate. The next book is Ezra, and Ezra was a priest who was in Babylon and took some of the people with him back to Jerusalem and reestablished priestly order, and that's his description of what happened during that time. There were probably 3 waves of repatriation, and this was one of them. Zerubbabel was another man who took maybe 50,000 with him back, but it was only a remnant. Most stayed in Babylon. Nehemiah was another personage. He was the cupbearer of one of the Persian kings who was allowed to take people back with him. And this occurred about 515 BC. Nehemiah is the next book. He was, as I say, the cupbearer of Artaxerxes, one of the kings, and he petitioned the king for permission to go back and to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. And the king said okay, and also gave him materials. Took him about 52 days. So this book describes that whole incident, and he became governor for about 12 years and reestablished temple worship and the priesthood. The wall was completed about 425 BC. The next book is Esther, who was a queen of one of the Persian kings, Xerxes, in captivity there, and under her that administration, a wicked man, administrator under the king named Haman, had it in mind to exterminate the Jewish people, just ethnic cleansing, basically. And miraculously, and this is the account of that incident, Haman was exposed, and the Jewish people were saved. And the Feast of Purim was inaugurated to celebrate that fact, which is a feast still practiced by Orthodox Jews today. Job is the next book. It deals with the problem of sin and suffering and death and that sort of thing, sickness, and how could God be good if he allows sickness. And it's a difficult book to understand. It's I think other books are explain things better than Job. There's many explanations of Job, and mine's probably not as popular as most, but I think in this book the how Satan operates is interesting, and I think that's instructive. It said Satan actually destroyed Job's health, his property, and his children, and then it was restored twice. At the end of the book you read twice what he had before. And it only covered about an 18-month period of time, and Job lived to, I think, 140 or so. So it was just not a long period of time in Job's life, but it is a bit cryptic in meaning. Psalms is the next book. It was kind of the Hebrew national hymn book. It has 150, basically they're lyrics to the songs. We don't have the sheet music or the music that went with them originally anymore, but 73 are attributed to David, 2 to Solomon, 12 to the sons of Korah, 12 to Asaph, 1 to Heman, not to be confused with Haman in the book of Esther, 1 to Ethan, and 1 to Moses. Some are prophetic, dealing with the coming Messiah, things that haven't happened or fulfilled by Jesus. And a lot of them deal with sorrow of living, of sin, and then often resolved to joy. And this theme is reoccurrent in the Psalms. The time period here is about 1000 BC. The next book is Proverbs, which are pithy statements of knowledge and wisdom. There's no real theme that you could attribute to the Proverbs. A lot of them, though, deal with foolishness and wisdom, and how wisdom is a better course than folly. A lot of them are attributed to Solomon, or most of them. It says in 1 Kings 4:32 that he penned 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. They're part of the wisdom literature. There's 31 chapters, so a lot of people will take a chapter a day. It's kind of convenient. Whatever day of the month it is, you just read a chapter and get a dose of wisdom. And there's, 30 verses per chapter or so. They're not long, but it's a good practice. The last chapter deals with the ideal wife. Ecclesiastes is the next book. It's penned by Solomon. And this is a difficult book. I used to read this many years ago as a new believer and was very confused by it. So I don't recommend it to a new believer, but I actually do recommend it to those who are unbelievers because it describes a life without God. It says in Ephesians that they that have no God are without hope. And that's kind of the theme of this book. It's vanity, vanity, all is vanity under the sun. It was penned by Solomon in a time, he started out well with God, but ended up poorly. He had 300 wives and 700 concubines, and he became embroiled in pagan religion towards the end of his life and left Yahweh in his heart. And now he's describing what life like at that time. And it's basically, I did this and I did that, and it was all emptiness. And interesting, at the very end, chapter 12, verse 13, he says, this is the conclusion of the whole matter. And he says, after all this, I'm doing this and doing that, I have all the money I need, anything I ever want, yet I'm still empty inside. He says, the conclusion is to fear God and keep his commandments. And I think there's really a lot of wisdom in that life without God is meaningless. And the other verse I'd like to point out in this book is chapter 3, verse 11, which says, eternity is written in our hearts. And this is the idea that everyone, without exception, has in their spirit, not in their mind, in their heart, the cognizance that there is a God. Now, God calls it a still small voice, so it's not a screaming thing. It's rather subtle, in fact. If you just cough a little, you'll miss it. But it is there. It's the idea that there's more to this life than what meets the eye. That somewhere in our spirits we know that there is a God and there's more to this life than what we see and what we can intuit with our own minds. Song of Solomon is the next book penned by Solomon. And it's unique. It's a kind of a love letter to the church. Some would say it's an allegory, and I would agree, of Christ and his bride, which is a topic dealt with in the book of Revelation and in the epistles. And it's very graphic, actually. It deals with sexuality and romance. And God really does romance us and is in love with us, even in that sense. It's an allegory, but the literal is dealing with Solomon and one of his wives who was a Shulamite, but it deals with the idea that God's pursuing us as a lover, really. Isaiah is the next book, and it's the first of what's called the major prophets. There's the major prophets and the minor prophets, and there's nothing. It doesn't mean that the major are more important than the minor. It just means that the major prophets are more. They're longer in chapter length and book length. I mean, and the minor prophets are usually 1 or 2 chapters only. So it's just major and minor instead of, in terms of quantity of literature. It's the most messianic in nature. That is, it deals with. Isaiah's dealing with the coming Messiah, who is Jesus. He was upper class and hobnobbed with royalty and was familiar with foreign affairs, so he was more of a man of the world. He urged reform in Israel to the old ways of worship, and tradition says he was sawn in two. So most of the prophets didn't do well. They were not well received. I think I'm going to stop here, and we'll take up next time with the book of Jeremiah and the continuation of the church history. So God bless you. See you next time. Bye-bye.